Mr. Chairman, good to be here today. I think. Some of which you've already heard, I'll go over again. I'll try to keep it brief and keep it moving, and not surprising, I'll probably wade off in the weeds in a few places. I've been known to do that before. First, I'd like to take a few moments for those that I haven't served on the committee with, that haven't tried to be through school finance stuff before, about why it's so doggone hard to do school finance. I believe there are three major factors you need to be aware of as you wade into this quagmire that you're at the front end of. First, our system is based on a taxable wealth per student. Think about that a minute. It's not about the wealth of the family or the wealth of the student. It's about the taxable wealth per student. And there's enormous differences across the state in that taxable wealth per student. So immediately a legislative body is confronted with, do we favor enormous inequity, or do we favor enormous redistribution? Or do you try to find a balance somewhere in between? So far we've tried to find the balance in between, and finding that balance is never easy. Second, you don't get to start with a blank slate. You start with the existing system. There are known disparities within that system. And part of your problem as you go forward will be the fact that those that have a disadvantage complain loudly, and those that have an advantage want to hold on to the doggone advantage they've got. So politically it becomes very difficult. Third, and probably most important, each one and every member of this body is elected not to represent the 5.5 million children, but to elect those that live in your district. That's hard to digest sometimes, and the public gets very frustrated with that sometimes because they think we ought to represent those that live across the state. But you get elected to represent those that are in your district. The complexities of those three interactions make school finance very difficult. Historically, the only times that there have been major movements made in school finance issues is either when there have been court press issues, where the courts have said, you've got to go do this, and y'all have been through that more than I have. The other times it's happened has been when there's been stellar leadership by the state elected officials. Not casting stones at anybody, I'm just saying it's very difficult for individual members to get up to speed that it takes. It requires almost either a court order or a governor or a lieutenant governor historically to move this needle. Changing topics. Talk about tripwires that are built in the system. Things that you'll stumble across as you go through this. First one, hold harmlesses. Beginning years ago, every time there's a major school refinance, somebody puts in a hold harmless. Goes back into the early 1990s, that some of them are still in place. Every time there's a school finance bill, there's a hold harmless built into it. It's inevitable. As you move forward with school finance this session, if you talk about tax compression, which I think will probably be talked about some, remember that as you talk about that, you almost certainly create another hold harmless. It's almost unavoidable. How you deal with that, whether you put that in for a self-expiration time, is that better? I'll do a test read 1, 2, 3, 4. Go with it? Okay. So be aware that you will probably create another hold harmless, and whether you sunset that hold harmless or how you deal with that is an important issue. Second tripwire is this issue of recapture. It has now become a huge source of revenue for the state of Texas. billions of dollars the state depends on for its revenue stream now. It now includes large urban areas, which was never the case when it first began. As Austin and Houston and Dallas and large urban areas with a large number of votes in this body get drawn into recapture, it becomes politically unsustainable. Sooner or later, those large urban areas will team up with the smaller people who are also in recapture and do something about it. And you may be very close to that precipitous point right now. Third factor that's a tripwire. Antiquated, obsolete factors that are built into that formula. Wow. They go way back, people. There was no logic in them much to begin with because it was what the legislature could afford, not what made sense logically. When you talk to the old timers that were here, what can we afford? That's what we'll set the figures at. So that largely drove the history of these formula factors. By far, I think the worst and most troubling of the factors is that wonderful thing we call CEI, Cost of Education Index. 1, 2, 3, 4 chairs have now tried to get rid of Cost of Education Index. Well, why is it so important? Because it's obsolete. It hasn't been updated for many, many years. 91, I believe, is correct. It's obsolete. It's based on 89 factors of cost of education. 1989, people. 1989 factors that are still in place. So, what do you do about it? One suggestion possibly is to update it every 2 years like it was intended to be. The problem with that, and the reason it hasn't been updated, is back to that point I made a while ago about having an advantage. Once you have the advantage of a high CEI, you sure as heck don't want to give it up. So you hold on to it through the legislative session, and the high CEI persists for another time, and another time, and another time. Even if you could exactly and succinctly pin CEI perfectly this time, it would only be a matter of a few years before somebody would say, well, you can't take it away from us because we're funded at this level. I would submit to you not only that the CEI is obsolete and imperfect, and will always remain so, because it multiplies at the beginning of the calculation. When you think about that long formula, CEI multiplies by the student count early in that formula and therefore exaggerates its influence. It not only exaggerates the influence, it makes it almost impossible for the other weights to function as they're intended to function. Because if you change the other weights, their multiplication by the CEI now becomes such an enormous movement of money that it's not possible to move that amount of money without great political consequences. So it's ineffective, it's inaccurate, it's a drag on adjusting the other factors. Then you get into the other weights. Let me suggest to you that all three of there are 5 weights, as you know. At least 3 of them, special ed, comp ed, and ELL, are probably undervalued in reality. And they're undervalued partly because of that CEI multiplier factor. As you wade through this, let me encourage you to spread those weights. They're intended to account for the differences in students. If you're going to keep this system in place, which nobody's had the boldness to do away with the core of the system, which we've tried a couple of times, but it hadn't happened. If you're going to keep this system in place, let me encourage you to spread those weights a little bit. Spread those weights to where they're more realistic in how they actually cost.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask you a quick question? But I recall that one of the things that you were trying to do, and I believe it was 15, and I think you tried in 13 too, but you basically said it needs to just go away, and you're going to not reshuffle the decks, but you looked at using that money to go into the basic allotment. Is that
I'll talk about basic allotment in a minute.
Okay.
But take that CEI money, and if you flow it right, you can spread the weights in a more realistic way so that the ELL kids and the comp ed kids and special ed kids can get the money they're entitled to without depending on the multiplier of the CEI up front. Told you I'd wade in the weeds a little bit. Let me shift gears again. We'll come back to some of that in a minute, another point. You'll talk a lot about testing. It probably doesn't surprise any of you who've been around here long to know that I'm not a big fan of high-stakes testing. I'm not a big fan of the STAR test in particular. I'm not a big fan of test results driving funding. I know there'll be some talk about that, and a small amount of that might be tolerable, but please don't get carried away with a lot of money being driven by test results. Testing should be used to inform and improve instruction for individual children, not be used to drive the structure of the funding system. It drives perverse reactions, ranging all the way from test prep that's excessive to try to get kids up so that you look better on the test when they're not really learning, to the really perverse things that happened when we got into the testing result last time, such as fraud. Some people went to jail over testing. Adults take perverse measures when money is involved. Change gears. Teacher pay. Heavens knows they're due more. We must pay more. We must attract better teachers. We must retain better teachers. Teacher pay is an essential part of what you've got to struggle with. But be aware that for many years the state has been trying to get out of the business of dictating teacher pay. The state minimum salary schedule is only used by a handful, just a tiny, like less than 50 school districts use the teacher minimum salary schedule. Each district presently sets its own salary schedule, and there's a wide variety in those, from real high to real low. So be careful that you don't wade the state back into the business of dictating teacher pay too much. Be careful of that issue. Local needs vary so much from a Houston to a San Antonio to a Panhandle community to rural Texas. It's almost impossible for this body to set teacher pay. When you come to issues like mental health guidance counselors, there'll be wide variety in your school safety issue about how those health counselors need to be used. We talk about guidance counselors, which will direct kids to college and career readiness. A wide variety of needs. Does a school need aides in early grade education? Do they need more VOTEC? Do they need more technical issues? Those are so varied across the state. You need to be cautious when the state starts dictating how you will direct that money in a particular way. Teacher pay should be encouraged, but largely left to those local districts. So what really works? What are some of the things and examples of things that are really working across the state? Early intervention in difficult populations is working better than almost anything else the state has tried. Pre-K is working where it's being done well. Reading academies, which were started before my time, worked well. But both of those issues have been stop and start funding. Chairman Huberty, you did a pre-K bill, one of your early sessions. And the funding almost went away immediately.
It did.
Reading academies during your tenure and certainly Harold's tenure worked well. And it was you and Florence Shapiro that did the reading academies, I believe. Is that right? Y'all were certainly part of it. They worked well. They were funded. And the funding went away. It's no wonder we're having trouble reading. Teacher evaluation, and by the way, those things, early childhood development and reading programs that are funded by the state, you do have control over. The next two things I'll mention have diminishing control from your perspective. Teacher evaluation, training, and placement programs. You can encourage those programs to some degree, but reality is that most of those programs have to be in place and developed by the local districts. Because again, there's such a variety from Houston to a Terlingua. What works in Houston or Dallas may not work very well at all in rural Texas. You have some ability to encourage that evaluation and training and placements type strategies, but you don't have a lot of control of that as a state. And the third one, you have essentially no control of at all, and that's community engagement. One of the things that it takes to make a school work well, especially if it's a school that's in trouble, is community engagement. There are stellar examples of that. Some of the schools here in Austin have had great turnaround success stories. Dallas is undergoing a great turnaround success story. Waco is undergoing a great turnaround success story, and there are others. But in each of those cases, it's involved a strong commitment from that community to say we will spend our money better, we will get involved in local school board decisions, we will be involved as a community and drive the improvement of our school. And quite candidly, you as a state body have very little or no control of that community's ability and willingness to step up and do those kind of things. Others, Roscoe, Far San Juan Alamo, there have been other great success stories around over the state where those communities have bought in early on, even before there was trouble, and said, we'll step in and do a community that's engaged in our schools and meeting the needs of our local community. A lot of talk about money and what matters. Let me give you 3 examples of things that are sort of different around the state where the money is making a difference and where it's being spent in ways that make a difference. The ACES program in Dallas, you've all heard about that one. It's basically a teacher evaluation and placement strategy that board and superintendent developed with great controversy. It is not highly test-based. About half of it's test-based on those teacher evaluations. The rest of it's based on principal evaluations, leadership of the schools, decisions made to place those most difficult schools with good teachers. It was expensive. They testified before your committee that it was unsustainable in their present financial situation. So what did they do? They went out and passed a tax election. And they hope to keep it rolling forward because it's making a huge difference in their schools. Second one, San Antonio Pre-K Initiative. Working. We're now in our 3rd year. The cohort of those kids that started in pre-K from those most difficult households in San Antonio are now reading at much better levels than they would have been without the program. There's adequate data to prove that at this point. Pre-K is working for San Antonio, but it costs money. They had to go out and farm a whole new concept in taxing that wasn't part of the school tax system. Took a totally different approach to funding that thing that says it's going to go away from our normal school taxes and do something different. But it worked. The third example I'd like to give you that's less talked about and much more nebulous is a phenomenon that's happening in Region 1 in South Texas. When you look at the success of the Region 1 schools, Region 1 has the highest rate of A-rated schools, has the second highest rated rate, percentage-wise, of B-rated schools, has the second lowest rating of F schools. And that's a school population that is, by all accounts, some of the most difficult in the state. Region 1 rose to the top in our rating system of all 20 education service districts. Now, there's a lot of factors to why, I think. Some of it's family concern. Some of it's the urge to push those kids out of poverty and the commitment of those communities to get them out of poverty. But I would submit that some of it's money. When you look at the funding in Region 1, it is the second highest per student of all the state regions. Why is that? Because they have a lot of heavily weighted students, and there's a predominance of that thing called a CEI in Region 1. For some reason, back in the 89 evaluation, the CEI was placed real high in Region 1, disproportionately high compared to the rest of the state. And they benefited from that. They now get $779 per student per year, more than the average of the regional service districts. Yeah, it surprised me. Money makes a difference, and how you spend it makes a difference. When these communities make decisions, they emphasize early education. They've emphasized, as far as San Juan Alamo community college agreements. They've done a lot of innovative things in the valley that are right, but many of them cost money. So money makes a difference. Certainly, how you spend it makes a difference. So, in closing, as you wade through these thorny issues in the months ahead of you, weeks now, not too many months still, let me ask you to ponder a few big things. When you talk about testing, let it guide instruction. Let it be directed toward an individual guidance of students and their instruction. Let me encourage you to widen those weight spreads so that the ELL kids and the special ed kids can be more accurately weighted in the great scheme of things. And to not multiply those weights by the CEI. And by the way, that's going to cost a little money, and you should fund that delta that it creates, because it will create a delta from your present level of funding to those spreads. Back to your basic allotment issue a while ago. I know everybody wants to put money here and yonder. I understand that. But let me encourage you that most of the money needs to be directed into the basic allotment. Why? Because it helps your hold harmless problem. Just mathematically, it moves the needle and your hold harmless becomes less of a problem. Mathematically, it redoes the calculation so that your recapture problem is lessened. It distributes the weights more equitably if you fund that into the BA and let those weights carry the money where it needs to flow to the right children. There's been a lot said about applying pressure to school systems. Took a lot of critique at the end of my tenure in this room for some of the bills we passed that applied pressure to school systems. Let me encourage you not to apply pressure to children so much, but to feel very free to apply pressure to the adults in the business. Whether you're talking about school board members, whether you're talking about administrators, there are adults in the business who should be held responsible for the performance of those schools. Don't be timid about expecting them to rise to the occasion, because most of them, not all of them, but most of them will rise to the occasion. So let me encourage you to not be timid about applying pressure in the form of ratings, TEA interventions, required training. There are tools that you have that can apply pressure to those school systems that are having difficulties. Don't be timid about that. With that, I'll shut up and say thank you for.
Does anybody have any questions for the chairman? Mr. Tallarico?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a new member of this committee, just want to thank you for everything you've done for
Thank you.
students of Texas. I wanted to go back to assessment and just wanted to ask you a broad question, which I feel like kind of is the crux of most of the things we're going to debate in this room over the next couple of months. Is there a role for assessment in state policymaking, and if so, what is that role?
Finding the balance of that role will always be difficult. There is definitely a role for testing. I'm not one of those that says you ought to get rid of testing. Let me just be clear about that. I think if you want to evaluate the student, that's an individual issue. I would advocate that if you want to evaluate the system, whether it's the state system or a local school district or a local campus, you could probably do that just as well with a reasonably designed statistical sample. Rather than spending all this money on individual student tests, every kid every year type concept. If your objective is to assess the system, then I think you can do it more efficiently than our present test every kid every year.
Thank you.
And I'll be glad to talk about community.
Yeah.
Countywide districts, if you want to.
Yeah, can you give us a briefing on that real quick?
Very brief briefing is if you go back to 84th regular session, House Bill 654, we filed one that would have created a congealed tax and finance system, very similar to what they tried during the countywide districts. Countywide districts were declared unconstitutional largely because there was no provision for the voters to ratify the initial tax rate. Had they included that initial tax rate ratification, it might well have been declared constitutional. We went back and tried to correct that in that bill. It was such a complicated and controversial issue that I didn't even give my own bill a hearing. It will not be an easy thing. I'm not saying you should do it now because we have a system, as we said a while ago. Good, bad, ugly, whatever it is, we have a system. It's been through a lot of litigation. If you start a new system, you'll certainly have to litigate a lot of issues. So I'm not saying that now is the time, but some of you are young enough, you'll be around here a long time. When this system finally collapses, and I believe it will eventually collapse, something related to a regional system or a grouping that narrows that band of taxable wealth per student. The system begins its complexity and can only end its complexity when the taxable wealth per student is narrowed.
Makes sense? Okay, well I will tell you that gave us a lot to consider, and on behalf of our committee, I want to thank each of you for your service over the